So this episode features Fiona Johnson, a regional organizer and member of Beaumont Society, which is a community for transgender people in the UK, and Robert Jensen, Emeritus Professor in the School of Journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. He has focused much of his work on the critique of pornography and of masculinity, developed in his book The End of Patriarchy, Radical Feminism for Men. Fiona and Bob will be discussing the difference between gender and sex, transgender policies and rights, feminism, and the recent controversies surrounding the trans movement. So before we get started, I would like to discuss the definition of some of these terms, like transgender. Who is a transgender person, right? I understand that it's someone whose gender identity does not correspond with their sex that they were assigned at birth. And that brings the question, what is a gender identity? So, Bob, can you give us the definition of those terms?
Well, first of all, I think we have to be skeptical of the term sex assigned at birth. Sex is not assigned at birth, it's observed. Mm-hmm. In the vast majority, virtually all human beings, there is no question about sex. There is a group called intersex, sometimes called disorders of sexual development, in which there is ambiguity. But for most of us, when we're born, nothing is assigned. It's simply observed. And that's important because sex, male and female, is a biological reality. It's a stable biological category, essential, of course, to understanding reproduction. None of us would be here without it. So that's important. Gender, going back to the 60s and 70s, feminists started to distinguish between biological sex and the cultural or social norms around gender. Back then, we have to remember, women were told, here are the limits on you, and they're because of your biology. So women were, for instance, told they weren't appropriate to serve in government because of their biology. And so feminists started to say, listen, you have to distinguish between biological sex, which is, of course, real, and the cultural construction of gender. And in patriarchy, that is a system of institutionalized male dominance, gender has historically been a weapon used against women, a way to keep women in a subordinate position.
Fiona, would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't. I would say that sex is actually for the procreation of the population and intercourse, whereas gender is an identity construct which we then build upon as we grow up. You're assigned a gender at birth, as Robert says, which is done on visual cues, but sex is something that you actually participated in later life.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not sure there's a difference of opinion there. I think the place where the feminist position from which I work from, which is typically, at least in the US and the UK, called radical feminism, recognizes that there is such a thing as gender, and it's constructed socially, as opposed to something that is purely internal, an internal subjective condition. So I think the reality of sex we would agree on. The question is, what do we mean by gender? So traditionally, feminists used it to talk about social norms imposed. And those social norms tended to be very rigid, very repressive, and very reactionary. And so that's the conception of gender, I think, still is the most compelling. If gender is also an internal, subjective, perhaps even innate and immutable condition, then that's where there's a disagreement within feminism.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there are stages to being transgender? Like, what does it mean to transition? Is it, some people don't realize that they are transgender until later in life. So are you transgender when you don't realize it? Or are you transgender when you realize it, but you don't come out publicly? Or are you only transgender when you actually come out publicly and people start, using different pronouns and different names? Or are you transgender when you change your legal documentation? What is the transition?
The thing is, there is no transition. You can actually be diagnosed as transgender by somebody who is supposed to be a specialist when you yourself don't consider yourself transgender.
So would you say that what makes you transgender is official diagnosis or official?
Again, it can vary from person to person. A lot of people will look for the official diagnosis to justify their change. Other people will have the change without seeking the official diagnosis.
Here, I think it's good to distinguish, because transgender is not a diagnostic category. Gender dysphoria is if you look at the APA statistical and diagnostic manual, you'll find gender dysphoria, which is some form of psychological discomfort about one's identity. And that's what clinicians diagnose. If you were to ask me what is transgender, I would say I simply don't know, because the transgender movement has never offered, from my point of view, a coherent description, definition, or etiology for the condition. So I understand what gender dysphoria is. I've talked to people who've experienced it, and that's like any other psychological condition that produces distress, requires treatment of some sort, support. The whole concept of trans, I think, gets us into more political territory than psychological territory. And in my experience, the trans movement not only doesn't feel compelled to provide a definition, in fact, celebrates the lack of definition as some sort of indication of being open-minded or something. I'm working on some new writing where I quote a trans author who says, "No, I can't define it, and I shouldn't have to." And that presents, of course, political problems when people are making public policy claims in support of an identity that they refuse to define.
I agree. It's one of the issues of drafting policies. You actually have to decide what makes someone transgender. And I recently watched a documentary about Caitlyn Jenner, who is a prominent transgender trans woman. And she mentioned in the documentary that she always felt different, but she couldn't quite pinpoint what made her different. She liked women, so she wasn't a gay man, but she felt very feminine. And then I think in the 70s, she saw a documentary, which was very rare at the time. The transgender movement was, I would say, pretty non-existent. And that documentary made her realize that she was, in fact, trans. So it wasn't until she understood, there is a label for how I feel, that she identified as trans. We don't hear the word transsexual at all these days. And I think it's a term that was being used back in the 80s, 90s quite heavily. And some say that transsexual is someone who actually undergoes a gender reassignment surgery. Would you agree with that, or would you say there's no difference between transsexual and transgender?
The trans community that we have no longer recognises the term of transsexual, because they consider that once they have transitioned and once they've had their surgery, they are in the category of gender that they should always have been in. So, rightly or wrongly, they will describe themselves as woman or trans woman, or man or trans man. So trans becomes an umbrella term for them actually undergoing the actual process.
I think this is one of the problems, that terms do change, and often they change without any clear rationale. So yes, transsexual is a term you don't hear very much. Most people in the trans community would prefer not to use it. I have heard, read, spoken to some older folks who still prefer it because they think it names their experience better. But once again, umbrella terms with no specificity are fine in a kind of abstract sense. But the minute one starts making public policy demands, terms need to be defined. And in the book I wrote, The End of Patriarchy, I just very simply said, if trans means that one is biologically male, but believes themselves to be in the category of biological female, if that's what transgender means, it's not that I agree or disagree. I simply don't understand what that could possibly mean. Right? On the other hand, if trans means that one was socialized in, let's say in my case, socialized into the category of masculinity and feels uncomfortable with that socialization and that expectation, Well, that I can understand. I can understand it in part because I've experienced it myself. And in fact, almost everybody I know experiences some sense of being out of sync with masculinity or femininity norms because they're, as I said, they're very rigid. So growing up, I was a short, skinny, effeminate boy. I met none of the norms of masculinity. I was equally inept in all sports. I didn't fit in with, that socialization. Today, that might lead a child like me to say I'm trans, but in fact, what I was a human being who was being forced into very rigid and repressive gender norms that didn't fit because those gender norms don't fit anybody entirely. It's one of the things I learned in talking to a lot of men about masculinity is that almost every man I've ever met has felt out of sync with some aspect of that masculinity norm. And that's why the feminism I work from focuses on the social nature of gender norms. It's something that comes from the culture, is imposed on us, and often in ways we don't like.
To what extent is being transgender a matter of genetics versus a matter of the environment that the person grows up in? I read the twin studies, which prove that there are genetic causes of transsexuality, although we don't actually know what genes are responsible for that. And the study said that in 20% of identical twin pairs, if one twin was trans, the other was trans as well, compared to only 2.6% of non-identical twins, right? So we understand that there may be some genetic predisposition, but how significant is that? How much does it determine that one person is transgender versus the environment?
Well, I'm skeptical of claims that genetics might make about this because the one thing we know about genetics is there is almost never a single gene for something. Right. The field of epigenetics, the interaction between genes and environment, is still relatively new. I think it's good to be skeptical about all claims especially based on small studies with small samples. But this gets to a bigger point, which is if you look at the literature, there is really no understanding of, the etiology, which is the, medical term for causes for transgenderism or gender dysphoria. The researchers pretty much admit they have no idea where this comes from. So again, people's experience is what it is, and it should be respected. But all of this is relevant when we start talking about public policy based on conditions and terminology in which there's very little and sometimes literally no understanding.
It's a case of nature over nurture, isn't it? You're identified as something and you're then brought up culturally as something. That there's no guarantee that they got it right at the outset, because I know people who have been classified as intersex and they have been made into males to live their life on the predisposition of the senior surgeon, whose attitude was, well, who'd want to be a woman?
Yeah. That's a very important point. The treatment of people in this category we now call intersex or disorders or differences of sexual development. In previous generations, there's some pretty horrifying stories, as Fiona just mentioned, of surgery on children, infants, to meet social expectations. And I do think that is changing, at least I hope it is. But I think it's important to separate the concept of intersex from the concept of transgender, and most of the intersex activists do want to make that separation because we're talking about two very different things. In one case of intersex, we're talking about anomalies in physical development. And that's quite different than the social and political issues involved in the trans movement.
Well, obviously, I'm going from people who have been designed as intersex and then assigned male from birth, but they have then transitioned in later life, recognizing that they feel that a mistake was made.
Yeah.
And it does happen.
Yes, it does. And that's why the sort of practices you're describing that were once commonplace need to change in the treatment of intersex
Indeed.
infants. Yeah.
Fiona, do you think that the trans movement has a positive or negative effect on the trans community? You hear the trans movement all the time, the trans ideology in news, and makes the headlines all the time. It defines our culture. An example would be Demi Lovato, who is a singer. She recently came out as non-binary, and she said in a few interviews that she may be transgender in the future. Don't you think that this trend of celebrities changing their gender all the time undermines what it means to be transgender, right? Demi thinks that she can just choose to be transgender. Isn't that wrong?
Yes, it is. But how far do you go? I mean, so we've got a German, Kim Petras, who's just won Grammys for her music, and she is fully trans. And as you referred to, Caitlyn Jenner, somebody who's in the public eye, who's used their status and their family background to highlight the trans in the wider world. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing a good job. In some cases, they may be doing a negative for the trans community, because a lot of the trans people just want to get on and live their lives and be accepted for who they are, and they don't want the publicity.
I think that's a good point, because, again, I'll go back to this distinction between gender dysphoria, which is a condition that results in psychological distress, and the more vague term of transgender. And I think one thing that's clear is there's a certain faddishness at the moment in attaching oneself to one of these labels, non-binary, for instance. There's the phenomenon of social contagion, where, especially with the prevalence of social media, you can track the dramatic increase in the number of children and young people, for instance, who identify as trans. But let's go back to another term, non-binary, which I simply don't understand what it could possibly mean. If it means that one doesn't fit with every social norm in masculinity and femininity, as I said, then I'm non-binary. And in fact, everybody I've ever met is non-binary, because nobody meets these patriarchal impositions of social norms around masculinity and femininity. So when people say I'm non-binary or pangender or any of these other terms, I'm not trying to be sarcastic, but I think that they basically have no meaning, or at least no meaning that's widely shared. Just as a quip, I once said radical feminists were non-binary before non-binary was cool. In other words, you go back to the 60s and the 70s, and these women were saying, listen, we don't want to be expected to dress in a certain way or cut our hair in a certain way or like certain things simply because of these patriarchal gender norms. We want to live our lives as people. And if, in some sense, that's a claim to being non-binary, but the term wasn't necessary back then because it was a part of a feminist movement challenging the power of patriarchy. And once again, I always go back to the political, which is where I think these gender norms come from. They come from the imposition of power on the part of men, institutionalized male dominance. Now, that doesn't mean women don't sometimes participate in that same system. Of course they do. But this is where I think the terminology again becomes important to challenge and critique.
They do seem to be very much buzzwords that people have latched onto rather than being actively relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as you said, Fiona, it's a media creation, right? And it's a reflection of people being unhappy in who they are, how they're perceived in public life, being unhappy with the roles associated with their gender. So why can't you just be a feminine gay man or a masculine gay woman? Why do you have to be non-binary and change your pronouns to they, them? A lot of people even identify as transgender because they see that that's where our culture is moving towards. Even though they may be just a feminine gay man, right? They may just like to wear women's clothes and be more feminine, but our culture is telling them, hey, that means you're a transgender. So I see that for me, that's a negative impact of the trans movement on on the people, on the society, because it makes people think that they're transgender when if, in fact they are not. And that brings me to the point of drag shows. So Bob, you say that drag shows are a caricature of women, and you advocate for a complete ban of drag shows. And Fiona, you say that drag shows are part of the European culture. So can we talk about the effect of drag shows on the trans movement and on the society?
Well, let me correct two things you said, or offer a friendly amendment. I wrote a piece arguing that drag shows are caricatures of women and femininity. Mm-hmm. It's not so much that I say that, but women in feminism have been saying that for 50 years. So the feminist critique of drag goes way back. And as is the case in almost everything I write about sex and gender, I am articulating ideas that are rooted in a radical feminist position. And I articulate them as a man in solidarity. And I wouldn't ban them. I'm a lefty. I don't like to enhance the power of the state to control people's lives. So the question isn't if adults come together and want to perform drag, do I think there should be a ban? No, that makes no sense. What's come up in the United States is whether drag performers should be invited into spaces with young people, including, fairly young children. And the justification is that it exposes kids to all sorts of, gender expression. But of course, you don't have to caricature women to help children understand the limits of patriarchy. And so I would oppose if, let's say, my local public library wanted to do a drag story hour. That's a phenomenon in the US these days. I would oppose it. I would go to a meeting and say, I don't think this is appropriate in a public space. But that's different than, of course, wanting to ban it. Basically, it always comes back again to challenging patriarchy. And when men take it as their right to perform in caricatures of femininity with exaggerated makeup and hairstyles, I feel my solidarity is with women who reject that as just one more imposition of, men's claim to a right to anything in patriarchy.
Fiona?
Well, I'd like to come back to the bit about the trans being gay. It's a very small number of trans people who are actually gay. Most of them are unhappy with the gender that they're in, that are identified as being in, and wish to change it. It's not their sexuality. On the subject of drag shows, I'm interested to find out what Robert thinks of drag kings and women parodying men to do such shows. Is that not a case of equality?
There's often this sort of argument about a mirror image. And of course, drag shows have none of the cultural resonance for drag kings versus drag queens, in part because, of course, women can dress in male clothing, at least in contemporary society, without a challenge. And drag king shows don't tend to be mocking of men in the same way that drag queen shows are. But it does raise an interesting question. When people who are on the bottom of a social hierarchy, let's say women in patriarchy, or people of color in white supremacy, what space is there for satire to critique through humor the arrogance of the dominant culture? So I think you have to realize, I would argue that drag kings and drag queens are very different endeavors. Drag king shows are very rare. I've actually never seen one, even on film. But if women are poking at, let's say, male arrogance, male claims to dominance, well, that's different than, I think, men performing in these caricatures of femininity, which are generally not in solidarity with women, at least not in my experience.
Well, I will say one thing first before I go on to something different, and that is a couple of weeks ago, I went to a drag show with a drag artist who did a bingo session, and the entire audience was female until one couple walked in and a man arrived. Literally, there was 20 women there, and then one man turned up. So the women that I'm experiencing are appreciative of drag as a performance act. So I will then go back to the historic status, much as it is one of the tribes of Africa where they had a historic elder who would have the stories of the village through its time, which they would then pass on to an apprentice. And when the elder died, then that person would then take on the apprentice, and the stories of the village would continue. In the UK and in Europe, before we had modern transport, those historic tales of the villages would become morality plays, and they were all performed by men, and every role, whether it was male or female, was performed by a male cast. And you actually look back in old handwritten plays of the time of Shakespeare and that, and for the younger males in the cast that were assigned the female roles, the terminology was dressed resembling a girl, but because it was all written in quill pens and such, it was then abbreviated to GRAG. So the historic relevance of drag is actually young males playing female roles in the morality plays of the Middle Ages. It was only when we got to the music hall and female performers were still banned that males would then take on the roles, and some of them would introduce them as parodies, such as the main role in pantomime season, which we have over here at Christmas.
A couple of things real quickly. Yes, there are many women who attend and enjoy drag shows, which is just to say that not all women agree about how to understand a feminist critique of patriarchy. Lucy, you mentioned in the intro that I've done a lot of work on pornography, and the feminist community is not of one mind on the question of, the sexual objectification of women in mass media. That's true in every political movement I've ever been part of. Not everybody agrees. So again, I anchor myself in what is typically called the radical feminist critique. And the women I'm speaking of who reject drag as a caricature generally share that point of view. The other thing is, of course, there are lots of things that have one meaning in history, but the meaning changes over time. And so how boys performing in female roles centuries ago is accurate, but not necessarily tells us anything about the politics of a contemporary drag show, for instance. The other thing to point out is a lot of these drag shows are highly sexualized, part of a hypersexualization, going back to questions around pornography, the increasing hypersexuality of mass media and pop culture more generally. And that's a separate question about whether that is healthy, both for society in general, but especially for children, to expose children to this intensified sexuality, usually well before they are psychologically, emotionally developed at a level to handle that. And some of these drag shows do cross that line into, I think, highly inappropriate sexualized performance as well.
I would disagree that they're highly sexualized, as I've been to many. I would refer back to the British government in the 80s introducing into schools something called Section 28 that prevented any tuition on gay and lesbian matters to children. That has since been overturned. Mm-hmm. Why should children be allowed to consider that they can be gay and lesbian, but not be aware that there is a transgender narrative in there as well?
I think it's important, and I agree, that children should be exposed in age-appropriate ways to sexual education. And I would agree that happily the demonization of gay and lesbian people, while it's not, of course, disappeared, has been rolled back considerably. When I was talking about hypersexualization, I was talking about sexual performances, pornographic in nature, to use the term kind of generically, that are, I think, inappropriate. So we can make a distinction between exposing children to sexual images and sexual performances in a way that is not psychologically appropriate, and sex education, which, when conducted in age-appropriate ways, is, I think, important. I would also make a distinction, and this distinction is important because the trans movement often kind of collapses it. There's quite a difference between the question of gay and lesbian identity and trans identity. Right? And I think they should be separated. Should children, in, again, age-appropriate ways, be made aware of the concept of transgenderism? Sure, like they should be made aware of everything in the world. But if that education goes forward, it should include the critical perspective that, as I've been saying, the radical feminist movement has presented about transgender. I think kids should be educated broadly, but that means not in an ideologically narrow way. And I think the reports I hear from people in the schools is that, at least in the United States, again, I won't speak for the UK or anywhere else, trans ideology is being presented as if there is no critique possible of it. And that's producing a backlash. The backlash in the US we hear about mostly is from right-wing and predominantly Christian organizations, which ironically object largely because they support patriarchy. But the radical feminist critique of patriarchy is relevant here. It just doesn't show up in the media. Almost all the stories I read, for instance, in the New York Times that have a critique of transgender ideology present that only as a right-wing critique. And so one of the reasons I keep talking about this as someone who is part of that radical feminist movement is the need to constantly remind people that there's a critique of patriarchy that leads to a critique of trans ideology.
I would also come back to pop music culture and the sexualization of young girls. Mm-hmm. We had a television series over here, which I believe was exported to the States, and we had a group come through called Little Mix, and they were 18 to 20-year-old girls. They were wearing very highly sexualized, revealing clothing in their outfits, yet their target demographic seemed to be 4 and 5-year-old girls. I mean, say, is that too young to have young girls of that age aspiring to be singers on a stage wearing bra and panties and high-heeled boots? I don't think so. So that's another form of sexualization which you're not addressing, and that's women directing it at younger girls.
Yeah, I agree with you, and the radical feminist movement has critiqued all of those phenomena. So there are women who participate in it. There are even feminists who endorse it. But here we're in agreement that the hypersexualization of children in general, but especially of girls, because that's where a patriarchal culture tends to sexualize children, is incredibly inappropriate. It's damaging psychologically. And it's part of a larger pornographic culture that says basically women and girls exist for the sexual pleasure of men. So here we're in agreement. And radical feminism has been, I think, the strongest and most consistent critique of that hypersexualization. You see it, the children's beauty pageants, which cultivate in young girls this idea that their main value in the world is their appearance, are horrifying. They really reinforce patriarchal values. So the movement I'm part of would reject those without question.
But when you say about the pageants for the children, isn't it more that the mothers are advocating their daughters go forward with it rather than the fathers?
Yes, but that just recognizes that in patriarchal societies, that in societies which can reward women for this kind of behavior, that women sometimes enforce patriarchal norms. I mean, that's been true and is not surprising. Look at right-wing religious communities in the United States, for instance, which are very patriarchal in structure. Well, often it is women who are enforcing those patriarchal expectations of both sons and daughters. Right? That's just to recognize the power of this institutionalized male dominance. A radical feminist critique doesn't say everything every woman does is appropriate. It's a political analysis. It looks at how systems and structures of power work. And we have to remember that women are often rewarded for adapting to and helping propagate patriarchal norms. And that's true, it's true of every system of unearned power and privilege there is. People of color can advance themselves in the United States by essentially doing the work of white supremacy. Poor and working people can advance themselves by abandoning a commitment to other poor and working people and just advancing their own interests. That's true of every system of power that's ever existed, that it's complicated. And that's why I've always found radical feminism so compelling, because it steps back to look at how these things work. They look at systems and structures, not purely in a liberal feminist way at individual behavior.
We talked about education, in children about being transgender. How about the availability of hormonal therapy and gender reassignment in children? Should this be allowed? Some people suggest that the suppression of puberty should be the first action when a child identifies as transgender to help with their mental health. And some say it's the opposite, that you actually decrease their happiness, their satisfaction, and their mental health deteriorates. What are your opinions on that?
There is no ideal time. As we said about people's medical situations, every individual is different. Some people will know from a young age that they are transgender and wish to change. I'm trying to think of one. We had one on television in the UK that transitioned at the age of 16. For others, that will be too early. They won't find out until they're in their 30s or 40s. So you have to follow procedures, but who lays down those procedures? Who says what's right and what's wrong? It's a very difficult subject. And once again, it comes back to where we were earlier with the political definitions of creating a guideline, a status, that status won't fit everybody.
Well, I think the use of hormones to impede puberty blockers, puberty suppressors, is an example of the kind of irresponsible medicine that's going on. Certainly, from my point of view, surgery on minors is medically irresponsible. Let's go back to something I said earlier. Everybody, including the trans movement, recognizes no one understands the etiology of transgenderism or gender dysphoria. Nobody even has a clue what causes this. And to use drugs, cross-sex hormones, and surgery with such a state of ignorance, in a sense, and I don't mean that as an insult, we just don't know, I think is medically irresponsible. Now, there are doctors, of course, who agree with that. There's a kind of a shift now. Both Finland and Sweden have suspended some of these treatments. Famously in the UK, the Tavistock Clinic was closed after a report. There was a report over the weekend of a whistleblower who was in the US talking about some of the irresponsible practices going on at a clinic she worked at. We have to recognize that when we say minors know with some certainty about this, we have to recognize we don't accept what minors claim to know in these early stages of development. And I believe that psychological treatment, talk therapy, is very important. But to start, in a sense, messing with the body in ways that are irreversible in children, I think is wholly inappropriate. We also have to remember there's now a growing number of what are called detransitioners. So far, they're mostly women who at one point identified as men and now regret it. That what they report is that to deal with their distress over being a woman in patriarchy, they sought some sort of solace in transitioning, and then learned that that was in fact not their problem, and often there had been, again, irreversible medical decisions made. So I think caution, first do no harm is the rule in medicine. And I think if we take that seriously, we would suspend all of this hormone and use of surgery in children, and be very cautious about, again, irreversible medical procedures in this context.
the fact is that the number of transgender people is on the rise. Some people say it's the result of environmental factors like endocrine disrupting chemicals in our food, water, soil, and some point to social media and our culture. How much does each factor, in your opinion, contribute to the rise of transgender people, especially kids? What role does social media play in this? And do you think that this culture just makes kids more open to express their true identity? Or do you think that kids have been captured by this trans ideology? Bob, do you want to start?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Fiona.
I do think that it is a social generation that's come through that are now looking at trans. Things like RuPaul's Drag Race has been going on since the mid-2000s. It's on something like series 15 now in the US. So it's becoming more aware of people. And then you've got, as we've referred to earlier, Demi Lovato, Caitlyn Jenner, and some Jazz Jennings and things like that. So there is more of a freedom of expression that people are able now with the internet to find out things that they couldn't find out 20, 30 years ago. We had unusual programs on British television back in the 90s, slightly referring back to what Robert said about detransitioning. We had somebody who was transitioning from male to female and kept stopping and kept resuming. And they made I think it was a 4-part series about them, which was very ahead of its time. But that was just a one-off. Now it's much more mainstream, and you can get information from virtually anywhere. And if you're really serious about it, you can even start ordering yourself online hormones, which again comes back to what we were saying about what age is too early. Should people be going down this route?
Yeah, I would go back to two things I've already said. One is to distinguish between gender dysphoria, people who have diagnosable psychological distress, and this broader concept of trans, which includes, as I think you're suggesting, a number of people who are simply being caught up in what I would call a fad, and I don't mean that as an insult, but simply, a socially acceptable way of dealing with what are often more difficult problems, such as how do you survive, for instance, as an effeminate man in patriarchy. I mentioned I grew up very non-traditionally unmasculine, you could say, and it wasn't easy. I grew up with a lot of fear, and if in that period the same ideology around trans had existed, would I have sought refuge in the concept of being trans because I couldn't figure out a way to deal with the brutality of patriarchy? Well, that's an interesting question. I recently wrote a piece by a woman who said I was a tomboy and growing up, and these days I probably would have been pressured to identify as trans. All right. The point I want to come back to is, if these are in fact, as I believe they are, largely the result of the imposition of these very rigid, repressive, and reactionary gender norms in patriarchy, the way to go forward is to fight patriarchy. The problem is fighting patriarchy is very difficult. Right? Feminism has the second wave, the contemporary version of feminism since the 1960s, has struggled to get even a small toehold in fighting things like men's routine sexual violence against women, or men's routine sexual exploitation of women, or men's routine claim to control the fertility of women. I mean, all of these things are deeply distressing struggles that go on. There's progress, we move forward, we get knocked back, there's backlash. That's what feminism does. It says, let's struggle with the underlying social system of patriarchy. And I think one of the reasons that trans ideology is so attractive to so many is that it offers, or at least purports to offer, a way out of the rigid, repressive, reactionary gender norms with no political struggle. And I can understand why people might find that attractive, but I think the political struggle has to remain at the center.
So let's move on to talk about trans women in female sports, which is again a controversy that has made headlines many times in the past year. The story of Leah Thomas, I think, is the most prominent one. Leah was a man, a competitive swimmer for Penn State, I believe, and she transitioned into a trans woman. Many say that was because she was not very successful as a male swimmer, and she wanted to win medals and be successful, so she transitioned. The problem was that she started competing with females before her hormonal transition was complete. She won every competition, every medal, and raised the questions of fairness. So what does this case of Leah Thomas mean for female sports? Should we have a third category for trans people to remove this, unfair physical advantage that Leah had? Where do we draw the line? Should the rules be decided on a case-by-case basis for each sport? Bob, you want to start? Or Fiona?
No, I was going to say, I think you bring a good point about your Leah Thomas, did you say?
Leah Thomas.
Yeah, actually competing before she's completed her transition.
I believe so.
Yeah.
Bob, you have the facts here?
Well, I don't really think that's the issue, because even after transition, there are still physical advantages that on average males have over females. So I would go back and say, what's the point of women's sports, separate women's sports in the first place? And it's obvious. It's because there are physiological differences on average between men and women. Serena Williams, who was, is possibly the greatest, female tennis player in history, was asked once about whether she would play against a man, and she laughed. She said, "That's ridiculous." She said, "I would lose 6-0, 6-0 in 10 minutes." Yeah. She was recognizing that the reason we have created and nurtured women's athletics is so girls and women can get the advantages that come from competitive athletics. Physical fitness, building confidence, developing skills. Okay. Everybody recognizes that if you abolished women's sports, that is, if you let men compete with women, women's athletics would be over. Now, here there is a scientific question. Even after transitioning with hormones, do men who identify as women retain some physiological advantages on average? And the reports I've read suggest that they do.
I would disagree.
There is a fair amount of work being done on this.
Well, meet some of the people that I know. I can tell you for a fact.
Okay, but I'm talking about research that looks not at individual cases, because individual cases can vary.
I'm not talking about one. I'm talking about dozens. You want to research. These people can be researched. I was going to come before we moved on to this. I was going about the difference between Leanne Thomas and a golfer called Mian Bagger, and I think there was another one. They went through the complete transition and attempted to play on the LPGA Tour. They failed to qualify. Originally, they were banned from qualifying, but under, I think it was your antitrust laws, they were told that they were allowed to qualify through the courts, but they were physically not good enough to participate post-surgery, post-treatment. And I know people who have gone through full surgery and full hormonal treatment that are adults, golf players, that cannot hit the ball as far as 14-year-old natal females in the junior section. You lose your muscle mass. You still retain the skeletal structure, but your muscle mass changes when you lose it through the testosterone suppression program. And then as you start on the estrogen programs and the androgens, your muscle mass rebuilds into a female form, and you do not have the same amount of power.
That's true. And Leah Thomas is a good example. So when Leah Thomas competed in the male side of swimming, Leah's times were better than after going through hormone therapy. But those reduced times were still good enough to win quite decisively when competing against females. So there's individual variation in how people react to surgery and hormone therapy. That's true. but we're talking about averages. And the question is, why should a small number of men who identify as women be allowed into female competition to reduce the opportunities for women? If a male who identifies as a woman chooses to continue to compete, I have no problem with that, but that person can continue to compete against men. And you could make the male competition in that sense open, and even women could compete. You can do it. There are any number of ways to devise categories that don't impose on women's athletics. And I think.
But what about the female South African athlete, Caster Semenya, with her high testosterone? She's now being told that she can't compete in certain distance races because she has an unfair advantage, and she's being told to race against men.
I agree. That's not a trans case. That's a case of a woman with, as you point out, higher testosterone levels than normal. And I don't think that the treatment of her has been fair. I think she should compete as a woman because she is a woman. Right? So the fact that athletics, the athletic institutions, have made what we might agree are inappropriate decisions in that kind of case doesn't speak to the question of whether men who identify as women have some sort of right to compete against women. And that's where I think, again, people are free to identify any way they like. When we face public policy demands that either create unsafe conditions for women or undermine opportunities for women, then I think from a feminist perspective, those are anti-feminist policies and we should reject them.
Well, do we look back to the unethical procedures of the East Germans in the 60s and 70s of allegedly converting male athletes to female so that they could dominate female events and garner lots of medals to show the strength of their political regime? That has now been found to be wrong.
And I would agree, and I think any decent person would agree that such tactics, such policies, such procedures are unconscionable.
But
I don't see how that affects questions about whether men who identify as women have a right to compete in women's athletics today.
But they have a right to compete. The point now comes on to where do they compete and how do they compete?
Yeah.
I would point out that we have a couple of, they are worldwide tournaments, but they tend to be based more in Europe. And we have things like snooker and darts, where the organising body, who both are under the auspices of one person, have decided that they are going to have a very, how can I put it, selective policy of inviting the previous year's world champion in that particular sport to compete in the men's world championship the following year. But the women's organisation doesn't do the reverse. Now, I think that's tokenism. I would support your view if it says that we have a full, true and open competition. But where you're inviting two particular women to compete in a field of 96, is that really fair on the women trying to advance the women's cause?
I'm not familiar with that example, but it seems rather silly. I would agree. What we're talking about is whether in competitions that are clearly delineated between male and female because of males' on average physiological advantages, those women's competition should remain for women. And men who identify as women, from my point of view, should compete as men or in some other category that want to be devised. But once again, what we're talking about is the trans movement saying we want to impose on women, and we believe men who identify as women have a right to do so. And I think it's a fundamental feminist principle to resist men's claims like that and to continue to create and nurture spaces for women who struggle in patriarchy to, achieve full citizenship and full opportunities.
But do you think it's fair, and I'll come to another example of a sport that's not so big in America, cricket, a female England international cricketer went across to Australia in what is our winter, their summer, to play cricket. And they were invited to play in a men's team and take the place of a man in that team. But there was no reciprocal arrangement for that man to try to continue their career and try to participate with a women's team. See, women want their own safe spaces, but they also want to invade the male spaces.
Well, when women compete against men, of course, women don't come with the physiological advantages, so it's not a mirror situation. Again, I not only don't know the specifics of that example, I don't know anything about cricket and what kind of physiological advantages men have over women. But I think going back to the controversy that exists in the United States, right, it's a question of whether women's and girls' athletics will continue. Because if it becomes open to men who identify as women or boys who identify as girls, then essentially the basis for women's athletics and girls' athletics is going to be eroded. And those are important important opportunities that were won through struggle in my lifetime. I was born in 1958. When, I was in school, there was no such thing as girls' sports. People would have laughed at the idea. So it was hard-won feminist struggle that created these opportunities for girls and women, and I don't think they should be eroded.
Well, that may be difficult for you in the United States, but I can say that my mother went to Cambridge University in the 30s, and she competed in sports. So UK, totally different. She was an athlete. She was a hurdler.
Yeah. Well, even when there were opportunities to compete in the United States, they didn't have the same kind of funding or opportunity. So I'm not saying that before the feminist movement, girls and women never competed. Obviously they did, but they competed not on a level playing field. In the United States, there's actual legislation that requires schools, for instance, to provide equal opportunity. And those, again, I think are very good developments. They're hard won, and they were won by feminists who wanted to create space for girls and women to have the same opportunities that boys and men have.
There was some diversity at our school in that the girls could play hockey, but only the boys would play cricket. But now we've got girls playing cricket, and there's currently a World 2020 women's tournament taking place in South Africa.
And that's all to the good. Even if I don't understand cricket and have not a clue what's going on in a cricket match, which I don't, I think those kind of things are, again, evidence of how feminist struggle has won increased opportunity for girls and women.
But we do have the problem now that in rugby, they're saying you have to be under a certain height and under a certain weight if you've transitioned to play. So if you happen to be 5'10" and transitioned, you're banned. But if you're 5'8" and transitioned, you can still play.
And I would agree that kind of attempts to massage the policy are failed. And I would go back to the claim that the feminist movement I'm a part of makes, which is that men who identify as women should not compete with women. They should compete with men, or there should be new categories established for people in such situations. But again, not to impose on women and undermine the opportunities of women.
Which I agree with, as long as we don't have women being allowed to compete in men's tournaments, denying men the opportunity. I will come back to the case of Lydia Ko, the golfer, who was invited on a sponsored invite to play in a tournament, which denied a male competitor the chance to enter and earn money towards their future career. That could have cost them their PGA Tour card for the following year. Is that really fair?
No, I don't know the details, but it does seem inconsistent with maintaining the integrity of women's sports, which means women can compete with women. The little footnote to that, though, is men's sports, at least in the United States, continue to be much more financially lucrative. And so we have not yet achieved anything like equality. If you're a men's basketball player in the NBA in the US, you're going to make a lot more money than the women's NBA. In fact, That's why so many of the women's basketball players compete in the off season in Europe, for instance, because they can't make enough money in the US. So I think the struggle is not only to maintain the integrity of women's athletics, but to try and create some sort of equality in the reward system. That's a longer struggle for all sorts of cultural reasons in the US. But yeah, maybe, if somebody said, well, men's and women's basketball players should be paid equally, I would say, sure. That's just not the system we live in the US.
Well, it is in some areas, because I believe that the US women's soccer team went on strike for equal pay and they got it.
Yeah, and that was a good example of how even when women fight to get into these activities, they're not treated equally. And in the soccer case, it was not only about compensation, it was about things as trivial as locker room conditions. Women were still not given the same sort of facilities to practice in as men and things like that. It's just a reminder that in a patriarchal society, again, using that term just to mean a system of institutionalized male dominance, women fight for basic rights and equality. And even when the patriarchal system gives some ground, it doesn't mean the fight is over. It continues for a fuller equality.
Well, I know it's separate from sport, but I will come back to the political situation in the UK. That before what was known as the Great War, the 1418 War, we had the suffragette movement, the suffragists. And when the war took place, they were asked to supplement for all the men that went to work off in the trenches. And so women joined the railways, the public services, the army, the navy, in administrative roles. And one of the conditions was that they would be given the vote. So post-war, the government at the time actually decreed that women would get the vote. But they specified limitations on it. They had to be over 30, married, and have a house. Nowadays, any woman over the age of 18 in the UK can be registered to vote the same as any male. It took time. They had to get their foot in the door first before they went to the next stage and the next stage until they got the full equality. So it's not going to happen overnight, but it needs to be progressed. And that is one example of how little steps can lead to the bigger resolution.
Cool. Talking about trans women and female spaces, let's talk about prisons, female prisons. Some say that trans women are especially vulnerable to sexual assault if they're placed with men, but some say that women are at risk of being raped and assaulted by trans women if placed together. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you think that trans women should go into female prisons? Do you think that documentation would help if someone is officially transitioned and has an ID that makes them a woman? Should they go into female prisons?
The situation here is regarding their actual transition status. If they've had the full surgery, then if they were in a male prison, they would be the victim. But if they have not had the full surgery, then they would be a threat to women. It's quite clear.
Well, I would start by recognizing that at least in the US, the prison system is morally unacceptable. The existing conditions in prisons in the United States is really atrocious for both men and women. So we start with that recognition. But then we come back to why are there separate men's and women's prisons? Because if you housed inmates together, even under better conditions, women would be at risk, just as women are at risk in general. Okay, so you have separate male and female prisons. When a man identifies as a woman, to me, that does not, justify housing that person in a women's prison. So again, there has to be some sort of resolution for all people who are vulnerable, but it doesn't require imposing on women additional levels of threat. And There have been cases now where that has happened, where even men who've been convicted of sexual assault and claim to now identify as a woman have been housed in women's prisons, which is, I think, just unacceptable. Again, the trans movement has never made it clear what some of these terms mean. When you have a man who identifies as a woman, that it doesn't mean that a male human being can be transformed into a female human being. So we don't often know what it means when somebody says, I am transgender. But
I mean, Fiona clarified that in the UK, it's when someone has undergone gender reassignment.
And in that case, the fact that someone has had surgery doesn't transform that person into a female human being. And I think accommodation should be made for that person. So the man who identifies as a woman has some claim or some right to safety, but women do as well. And once again, what the trans movement in general does is say, men have a right to impose, by virtue of their claim, a right to be in any particular space. And let's remember that women have reasons to be afraid of men, that the vast, people can be violent, people can be abusive around any dimension, right? But the vast majority of sexual assault, sexual harassment, sexual coercion, the perpetrators are men. And women understand that, and women seek often spaces which are free from that threat. And I think that's an appropriate feminist result, for women to have spaces to be free of the intensified threat. And that's where I think women's concerns are valid, and things like men who identify as women in, let's say, a changing room or in a prison, that's inappropriate. It imposes on women demands made by men who now identify as women, and I don't support them. And the radical feminist movement in general does not support such things.
Robert, can I ask, have you ever visited a prison?
Have I ever? I work with prisoners, and I have. When I was a newspaper reporter in my younger years, I was in jails and prisons. Yes.
Right. It's just that I worked in the prison service in the UK for 20 years, and I visited men's, women's, and youth offenders' prisons. And in general, there is a policy where the violent prisoners and those under, shall we say, the possibility of violence against them are usually housed in separate areas within the prison. So they're guaranteed to be in the prison which their gender specifies, not the gender they identify with, but they would be kept in a specialist area, and their contact with the other prisoners would be limited.
Okay.
So what, when it comes to legal transition, Fiona, can you talk about the requirements that are necessary to be able to change your ID, to be able to change your name officially? Do you have to have undergone gender reassignment surgery, consultations? How does it work?
You can actually call yourself anything in this country if you wanted to. You obviously do have a name that's assigned to you at birth, usually given to you by your parents. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use the name they've given you. I could name somebody I worked with who hated his first name and used his middle name. That's just.
But if you want to change your ID,
if you want to change your ID, there is nothing to stop you having what they call a deed poll or a statutory declaration approved by a legal department, such as a solicitor, and you can change your name to anything you want. But actually, when it comes to changing your gender and actually getting a birth certificate and passports and things like that, you do need to be undergoing some kind of gender identifying treatment.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, do a lot of transgender people want this? What impact does it have in their life when their legal documentation is changed, when their gender on their legal documentation is changed?
For some of them, losing their old name is everything. For others, it's just a case of it's another stage on the ladder, another step up the rung.
Mm-hmm. And do you think we should sorry, Bob?
No, I was just going to say, again, I think it's important to keep sex and gender separate. So on birth certificates, we don't identify the gender of a child, we identify the sex, male or female. And I think what we have to recognize is there is no such thing as a sex change, right? You cannot change a male human being into a female human being or vice versa. So if documents reflect sex, then that's one question. And if I was born unambiguously male, I am not intersex. Right? There's nothing I can do to change my sex. Right? Now, the changing of gender gets complicated on documents. Let me give you an example. I was in Sweden a number of years ago at a feminist conference, and at lunch I sat with women who worked at the Statistics Bureau of the Swedish government. Apparently the Swedes are big on statistics. They chart everything. And I asked these, they were all women, and I asked them, how do you feel about, people being able to switch their sex designation? And they were worried because they said, at that point, there are no reliable statistics. Right? So take an obvious point. If I'm a man and I sexually assault a woman, and I then change and identify as a woman, does that mean I raped that woman as a woman because I claim to be a woman? Categories and record keeping and all sorts of things get pretty odd pretty quickly. And so I don't see any reason we can't, if we're going to collect statistics bifurcated on sex, which in some cases is important if you want to chart the way women are discriminated against. Take pay discrepancies. Right? If you're in a workplace and you want to demonstrate that women are systematically paid less than men, which they often are, what happens when a man identifies as a woman? Does that salary then change to the female category? I mean, it doesn't make any sense because the underlying claims, in some sense, are so unclear, even incoherent. And that's the problem we get with gender ID laws, in which one can simply switch categories based on a self-declaration. I don't think there's an easy answer to it, but I don't think that simply self-identification is the answer.
It's an interesting point you make about the salaries, because in the UK civil service, that you get appointed to a grade, you're not appointed to a grade on gender. So you get the equal salary. But we did have a situation a few years ago where they changed the rules on pensions, where women used to be able to retire at 60, men would have to wait till 65. They changed it to 66 rule, and women took out a petition in Parliament and took it to court to say that this was discrimination. And I believe they lost.
All right. So that's an interesting question about the complexity. So if older women who are now in retirement, spent their working life in an economy that systematically underpaid them, as was the case, right? That women were underpaid. Now, I recognize that's changing, especially where you have union rules and can mandate equal pay. But what do you do to recognize the historic discrimination, in this case, let's say for older women? Patriarchy creates all sorts of problems when it creates two classes of people, male and female, dominant and subordinate. And working out how to make account for that is tricky, but that's what we're trying to do. And the feminist position from which I work simply says you don't solve those problems by eroding the gains that girls and women have made. And I think in this case, self-ID would erode some of those gains.
Yeah, what it did mean was that any man who had transitioned to female in the hope of getting the pension early found that it didn't matter. They weren't going to get it any different.
So talking about legal rights, I wanted to talk about the bills that have been passed recently that relate to the trans community. Can you talk about what has been done to advance transgender rights, or what has been done to restrict them on a legal level?
Right. In England, well, we have effectively four separate countries in the United Kingdom. England is the majority size, then the smaller countries affiliated are Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Each of those have their own nominal parliament and can set some rules for themselves, but they have to be overseen by the overall UK government. There is no government for England as it stands. What has happened here is that the government in power a few years ago said that they were going to look at gender identity, and with change of prime ministers, they never did. Scotland, however, has had a consistent government of Scottish nationalists, and they have recently introduced legislation altering the gender self-identification in Scotland. The UK government has now said that they will veto that legislation going through because it is now out of step with the rest of the UK. The trouble being that the rest of the UK is out of step because they didn't progress what they intended to 6 or 7 years ago, and Scotland went ahead.
Interesting.
In the US, there have been a variety of proposals depending on the state one lives in. And it's kind of a mess at this point. When it comes to legislation, I think there are some questions. One is, we've already talked about self-ID, whether someone can simply switch the category of male and female on documents. The feminist movement I'm a part of rejects that because of the complexity and confusion I've already talked about. Sometimes it's not about legislation, but it's about policies in schools and things like that. So I think I've already made it clear that allowing men who identify as women into single-sex, all-female spaces, whether it's a changing room or a sports team, is an anti-feminist and inappropriate policy. And the other big issues tend to come around medical treatment. And I would support a ban on things like puberty blockers and surgery on minors for the reasons we talked about earlier. That's all, I think, consistent with a radical feminist understanding that the goal is to challenge patriarchy. But I also would point out that in the United States right now, as I said earlier, these controversies are being driven by typically right-wing conservative, often religious folks. And the policies they often propose, I think, are often counterproductive. So for instance, in the state of Texas, where I once lived and where you are now, Lucy, I'm tempted to say unfortunately, but I won't make the editorial comment. The Attorney General has proposed treating what is called gender affirming care, the treatment that I disagree with, treating it as child abuse and prosecuting doctors and parents. Now, that is counterproductive. That's going to do nobody any good except right-wing politicians who are playing to their base. So again, it's important to distinguish between conservative, typically patriarchal proposals and feminist proposals, which are designed to guarantee opportunities and safety for women and girls.
Is there healthcare coverage for sorry, Fiona, you wanted to add something?
I was just going to ask. I was reading something on the BBC News the other day. We get world news on it, and it was talking about, I think it's a New York senator or congressman, George Santos, who's now been revealed as being a drag queen in his native Brazil when he was younger, and yet he's supposed to be very, very right wing, and against all these
Yeah, the George Santos case is a peculiar note in American politics at the moment. He fabricated most of his resume, was elected on essentially false pretenses. And it's not, the bigger point is it's not uncommon to see in very repressive right-wing, often again very religious politicians and people, a kind of history that points out hypocrisy. The hypocrisy, first of all humans are capable of being hypocritical, and you see it in all political movements, but it's a particular specialty of the right wing, I think, in the United States. Lucy, you were going to ask about healthcare coverage, I think.
Yeah.
And here I think I'll just speak for myself. I don't believe that there should be healthcare coverage for these treatment for minors, obviously, since I don't think the treatments are appropriate. The question of whether public funds, let's say Medicaid or Medicare funding, should be made available for, what used to be called sex change operations, then were relabeled sex reassignment surgery, and now are more commonly called gender confirmation or gender affirmation surgery. Should public money be available for that? I would oppose it, actually, because I don't think it's consistent with the best way to deal with the problem of gender dysphoria, which is real. I think we, by moving quickly to surgical and drug and hormone interventions, make it less likely that we will pursue other avenues to deal with the question of gender dysphoria and distress. But when we're dealing with adults, it's a much more complicated question. Obviously, I don't support laws that would prevent people from pursuing medical procedures that they want as adults. That's a freedom of choice question. But whether public money should be spent on it is a different issue.
Now, I'm going to stand as slightly apart from quite a few of the trans community in the UK here, and I would say that I'm not fully in support of medical intervention on anybody's case. It obviously is the right of the individual to choose, but not necessarily is going to be the right course of action for them. Again, coming back to points that we made earlier. But in the UK, we have a policy which is, again, divided amongst the 4 different nations, that if you're in England, once you reach an adult stage until the age of 60, you have to pay for your medication, although we have a National Health Service. In Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, your prescriptions are free. So if you're prescribed a female hormone, depending upon what part of the country you're in, you'll either have to pay for it nearly £10 for a batch, or you won't have to pay for it at all. Obviously, you are entitled to gender confirmation surgery if you wish to have it and you go through all the procedures in the UK, and you can have it done on the NHS, but you're also free to go privately. I know that one of our members has just had their surgery of confirmation done in Spain. So it's a wide field that we can use over here.
How difficult is it to get it approved by the NHS?
Very difficult. I know COVID's made it worse, but when you've got a clinic in north of England that holds 3 clinics a week and sees 9 people per clinic, that's 27 a month. So there's 3 clinics in the month, and they've got a waiting list of 1,700 cases. And the NHS recommendation is that you should see a specialist within 18 weeks. We have got people who are waiting over 10 times that, 180 weeks, 5.5 to 6 years. It's virtually impossible, which is why a lot of people go through private hormones, online hormones, private surgery, because they just don't want to wait. And in a lot of cases, it's the wrong thing to do. As I said, I may stand different from a lot of the people in our community here and saying that surgery is not always the solution. We have, unfortunately, the statistics aren't accurate now because post-COVID, but pre-COVID, we were estimating that 41% of those who'd had gender reassignment surgery were taking their own life within a year of their surgery.
Wow, that's scary statistics.
That is a scary statistic. And we have, proportionally, again, before COVID, it was a case of surgery was performed male to female for 3 cases for every female to male case. And the thing was, most of the male to female cases were providing the end of life in the 12 months.
But there's not just one surgery. I believe the whole process is several surgeries over a period of
There are several surgeries that can be done together, but there are several surgeries that need to be done separately.
So did the people just change their mind on their gender, or what made them take their life?
The worst one I heard of was that they left a note for their wife, who they didn't even confide in, and says it wasn't what I expected, and that was within 5 days of surgery.
Wow.
Yeah, it's not always the right thing for the right person, and so I'm one of these that advocates that it's the gender role rather than the physical body that's the matter. As I said, I will get shouted down by a lot of the trans community who will say that surgery is right for me. And I have a number of friends for whom they've had the surgery and it's the right thing that they've done. But it doesn't mean to say it's right for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Are transgender people legally protected from workplace discrimination?
They are. We have an Equality Act of 2010, and gender is a prescribed exclusion. There are certain areas where natal females have an advantage, such as medical care. Mm-hmm. If they're in an elderly home, they can be in a female elderly home. But if they have to transition, then it is the right of the care provider to either offer them care or refuse it on those grounds, and that's perfectly right. So where you've got a job that involves female only spaces, they will employ female only staff. So maternity, for example, is a very good thing. You might have male specialists in maternity, but they won't actually be in for maternity care of certain aspects.
Okay. Let's talk about social oppression. We covered it a little bit in our introductory call. How does being transgender intersect with other forms of social oppression that relates to race, religion, ethnicity, or language? Do you think that sex differences are more meaningful than racial differences?
It's going to be different for the UK than it is for the US. We don't have the same sort of racial tensions. You have to remember that Britain had an empire in the 1700s, 1800s. Even up till mid-1950s, we still had parts of Europe, and some of the parts of Europe, parts of Africa and Asia that still had British rule. Even now, we have a Commonwealth where they're all affiliated to now the King. And so we have that. So there is this thing where people had the right to come to the UK, especially after the Second World War, when we'd lost a lot of the population. We had what they called the Windrush generation. A lot of people from the Caribbean countries came across to the UK to work, and we're now getting the second, third, fourth generation Caribbean people here. So our racial harmony back in the 60s and 70s was poor. But we've had Race Relations Act since then, and things have improved. That's not to say it's perfect.
Yeah.
We've also had things like the Sexual Offences Act of 1967, which decriminalised homosexuality. So the whole gay, lesbian, bisexual thing has now blossomed and is now much more acceptable. We have lots of people, again, coming back to the media, that are openly gay performers. So trans has basically captured onto the back of those in recent years to come through, and it is becoming more acceptable to be transgendered in the wider community. You can get a job and everybody will accept the fact that, oh yeah, fine, you're this, we'll just get on with your job and we're not worried.
Bob?
I would distinguish between anti-discrimination law. Everyone, no matter what their identity, has a right to full citizenship, to be free of things like police brutality, to have a right to the means to live. That has never been in question. No one in the radical feminist movement challenges that. The question about legislation, as we talked about, is when men who identify as women claim a right to be in single-sex, all-female spaces. So that's an important distinction. In terms of comparing different forms of oppression, the big three we tend to talk about are race, class, gender. You can add nationality. Well, it's clear that all of those are quite different. Patriarchy is the oldest of these systems of oppression. It goes back thousands of years, and it's rooted in men's attempt to control the sexuality and reproductive power of women. Racism, as we understand it in the context of modern white supremacy, is about 500 years old, and it was a tool of empire. It was a tool that largely in the beginning Europeans used to rationalize the domination of the world. There is a physical component to racism in the sense that there are observable differences, let's say, between black and white, but that's not really the basis of the system. So race and sex are quite different in that way, both in how long human beings have been struggling against them and in the physical realities. Things like class and imperialism, where under economic systems, the poor have fewer opportunities, or people in the global south who suffered under the heel of the global north for so long. Those are entirely different. And so, as we often say, at least on the left in the US, it's not about ranking which kind of oppression is the worst, because that will depend on the moment. In one particular situation, race might be the dominant factor in the mistreatment of people. In others, it might be sex. So what we try and do is see the commonalities, how people rationalize illegitimate power in unjust systems without pretending they're all the same. They all have different historical roots. They all have different manifestations, but they all do work on the same logic, which is one group of people says, I have the right to control another group of people. And so this is a highly contentious question in the US these days, but I think we can step back and see both important similarities and important differences in all these systems.
Yeah, we've got to look at the fact that we have a completely different system when you compare it to somewhere like Afghanistan with the Taliban and their current attitude towards women. They're banning them from schools, from further education. They're banning them from the workplace. They really are very oppressive.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think it's also, especially when we talk about patriarchy and the oppression of girls and women, to recognize it happens in all sorts of contexts. So take a society like Afghanistan, which is basically a kind of feudal society when it comes to women. There's I can see no justification for such a thing. On the other hand, in the United States, some of those same kinds of restrictions, for instance, girls not being allowed to go to school, obviously doesn't exist in the United States. But we also have this hypersexualization of girls, and we have incredibly high levels of sexual harassment and sexual abuse, which dramatically affect the opportunities for girls and women. A friend of mine once joked, although it was a serious point, when the United States invaded Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks, and Americans said, well, we're going over to free the women of Afghanistan. He said, it looks like there are two choices in the world. In a place like Afghanistan, if you're a woman, you can be feudal property. If you're in the United States, you can be a capitalist commodity, reflecting the way women's bodies are bought and sold, especially in the sexual exploitation industries. Yeah. So to point out the regressive character of one society is not an apology for the regressive character of another. And I think there are very regressive elements in the sexual politics in the United States, largely around the way that the sexual exploitation of women continues, and in fact has intensified in recent years. I've been involved in the feminist anti-pornography movement for more than 30 years now, and it's one area where we've lost ground, right? There is more pornography, more graphic sexually explicit material than ever before. It's more overtly cruel and degrading to women. It's more overtly racist. The systematic abuse of women in the production of pornography is well documented, and yet it continues. So 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 1 step to the side, 2 more steps back. It gets complicated. But no society in the world today, I think, is doing particularly well in combating the deep patriarchal roots of these cultures.
You mentioned Afghanistan, which is dominated by Islam. So I'd be curious to know, how is being transgender viewed in religion? Christianity or Islam?
It's not really, but if you actually go right there back into the Bible, we're all in breach of the Bible because none of us are all wearing white.
Right.
I don't think it ever makes sense to talk about a single religious position on anything, because Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, they are all internally contradictory as well.
Yep.
Right? And at war. So I have read, I don't have a lot of experience with this, but I've read that in Iran, which is, an Islamic theocracy, that gender confirmation, gender affirmation, sex change operations, whatever, are available because there it would be preferable to change your gender category than to acknowledge being gay, for instance. So these vary widely. In the United States, conservative Christianity is critical of trans ideology. Liberal Christianity tends to embrace it. Yeah. And so there is no single religious perspective, I would argue, on anything. Religions are these sprawling, ideologically inconsistent formations. And we see this all the time. I mean, you see it both in denominations in the US and the UK, where there are splits internationally between more liberal US, UK versions of, let's say, the Anglican tradition and more conservative ones in Africa, let's say. So,
indeed,
religion is never of one mind on anything, as far as I can tell.
And it has been written in history, and we can't go back in history. As somebody once said, history is a place that I can never visit. Those books were written in a time, and that time is not now.
Yeah.
Well
we
said.
have moved on in society. We have moved on in the world. Do they still have the relevance? Some of the 10 commandments, like thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, we could still abide by. But futile things like thou shalt always wear white is totally impractical.
Well said. So last topic I wanted to cover is feminism. Both of you are feminists. You consider yourself feminists, but neither of you are females. Fiona, can you make the case to Bob, as to why he should accept trans women in the radical feminist movement that he's part of?
That's just it. I can't. I can recognize his point of view, and his point of view will remain the same. I could argue till I'm blue in the face, and he could argue in the reverse. We will stand at opposing viewpoints, but I recognize his right to that viewpoint. As Voltaire says, I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it.
Okay.
And I would simply say that the term that you're referring to, trans exclusionary radical feminist, which is usually used as an insult, I think has always been an inappropriate term. The radical feminist movement I'm part of is often labeled as a TERF movement. Mm-hmm. But I think what radical feminism is an invitation to everyone, including men, which is why I'm part of it, to reflect on again, I'll use that term, the rigid, repressive, and reactionary nature of patriarchy, which does give men short-term material advantages, but also comes at a cost to men. That feminism invites everyone to critique the way that those gender norms have constrained everyone most dramatically and with the most, serious injuries to girls and women. So I don't consider myself trans exclusionary. I think radical feminism offers an alternative to understanding where this discomfort with masculinity and femininity in their hardened form, where it comes from, and to be part of a feminist movement that challenges not only those gender norms, but the way they lead to abuses, most especially, I think, the epidemic levels of men's violence against women, which, for all of the work feminists have done, still are at unacceptably high levels. Just before we came on this podcast, I was reading about a new CDC study of the degree to which girls are subject to sexual harassment and sexual violence, the mental health costs of that routine harassment and violence. These are things that I think are at the core of a feminist movement, and radical feminism invites everyone to be part of that challenge.
Well said.
I would just say that I hate putting labels on things. As somebody once said to me, labels are for Amazon parcels.
Yeah, that's very well summarized. So my last question is, if you could wave a magic wand and shape people's mind about one trans-related topic, what would it be?
Could you repeat the question? I didn't
if
hear
you
the first
could
part.
wave a magic wand and shape people's mind about one trans-related topic, what would it be?
Well, I can just say really quickly, I would encourage people to think about how, while male and female are stable biological categories, masculinity and femininity are cultural categories that have changed over time. And when we reflect on how, as a man, because I tend to speak primarily to men, if we reflect on how those categories have disadvantaged girls and women and also limited the capacity of men to experience the full range of human emotions,
yep.
I think it's clear that patriarchy is a loser for everybody.
Fiona?
I'd agree with that, but I would also, my simple answer would be, is surgery the only solution?
Well said. Well, thank you both for coming on this podcast. It was a great discussion. I hope you had fun and you enjoyed this disagreement. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you very much.